Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the next installment in my cast net making video series. Now in previous videos in this series I talked about the different kind of tools you're going to need to make a cast net. I talked about the different materials you would actually put into your net. I talked about the two different kinds of cast nets that you could choose from before you start knitting. I also talked about the different specifications you were going to have to decide on before you started knitting. And so you're probably thinking today, finally, we're going to get to start knitting a net. Well, that's not actually the case, because before you can knit, you got to learn how to put this line onto this needle. Now, first thing you need to understand is that you can make netting without this needle. You can simply take your lines, cut them to length, lay them all out, and start tying knots with your hands. But that wouldn't be knitting, and it would also be quite wasteful. I don't even know what you would call that, maybe macrame. But when you have a line on a needle, you start at the very end of your string, and when you get done, you've gone all the way to the other end of your string or line. Whereas if, the method of you doing that without any tools, what you're going to do is cut things to best you think you can to get them to the length you need, and then when you get to the end of your net, you simply cut off all of the waste. With a needle, you have very, very little waste. And another thing about hand tying a bunch of lines into a net is very, very time consuming. But if you just learn a few simple knots, this needle can make a net go much, much quicker. The first needle we're going to talk about is a Loomis needle. If you can see, it says right here, Loomis, Seattle. So that makes me believe that the name Loomis is actually the manufacturer. But it's also called an H-type needle. And you can see it looks like the letter H when viewed from the end. I don't know why it is, but traditionally on the southern coast of the United States, people who make cast nets never use these. I've talked to, not too many, but a few net makers, all elderly people, and none of them use this type of needle, but I haven't seen any reason so far why you wouldn't use one. If you prefer this type, then this is the type you should use. I suspect because of the traditional knot that we tie here on the southern coast of the United States, that the Loomis needle simply doesn't lend itself to that very well, but we'll find out later on. And for the most part, you need a very long, very skinny needle to tie some of the knots we're tying, because as you're tying, depending on what kind of knot you use, you have to actually run a loop and then come through a loop, and after you get through the loop, go through another loop. And if you've got a fat needle or a short needle, it won't work. And this is about the skinniest, longest one I've seen of this particular type. But the reason I want to show you this first is because it's, I had said earlier that you're basically, the difference between knitting and macrame is that macrame uses individual strands tied together, whereas with knitting, you're using basically one string from start to finish. Now, obviously, if your net is long enough, or if your string is thick enough, you're going to have to use multiple strands, but those strands will be added in by tying one end to the other. Whereas with macrame, the lines are laid in next to each other side by side. But, theoretically, you could make an entire cast net using just one piece of string. Basically, when you're knitting, what you're going to be doing is taking your spool with one piece of line on it, tying a knot, throwing it through, tying another knot, throwing it through, and going on down the line like that. Problem with that is that this spool is rather cumbersome, and every single knot you tie has to be through a mesh that's big enough to allow this spool to pass through. And if this spool will pass through it, a fish this size will pass through it. So what we have to do is transfer the line that's on this spool over to a spool that's a little more comfortable to hold, as well as smaller, so that we can go through a smaller mesh. Now, how we're going to start our string on this needle or shuttle is just to hold it steady with our thumb and get it going. As you get more and more line on your needle, you will eventually be able to let go of your string because friction will hold it in place. And it doesn't take very long. You get a few strands on there and you can pretty much let go. But you want to keep it tight so that you're able to get as much line as possible on your needle. By tradition, we call these needles on the southern coast of the US, but in doing research I find that a lot of people who knit call their shuttle what it is, a shuttle. Why it's called a needle amongst net makers, particularly in this region, I do not know. But most of what you'll learn in this art is through tradition. And it's local traditions, because every area of the country has a different kind of net that they use for different kinds of fish, and because of that the language is different, the words that we use. If you notice, I've let go of the string. And that's why I say that this is basically another spool. We're just rolling line on it as if it is a spool. Okay, we're almost done with putting line on our needle. And the way we're going to determine whether or not we have enough line is simply by looking down the side of it. This Loomis type or H-type needle is basically the same width both ways. So if you put too much line on here, you're going to be defeating the thinness of the needle. In other words, if you can put more line on here and still knit with it because the size of your mesh is very large, then it would actually be better to go to a large needle, and rather than overloading it this way, simply loading it up properly, and that way you still have a large amount of thread. Now the reason you want a large amount of thread is the larger the amount of thread you can get on your shuttle or needle determines how many knots you have to put in your net. Every place where you tie in new string is going to make another knot. You want to have as few knots as possible for tie-ins. You can't avoid making knots where you tie your meshes, but the knots that you have to tie where you add string can be avoided by simply using as much string as possible. But in any case, we'll go ahead and cut this off right here. This is about right. So if you put too little line, not enough line in, the problem is that you're going to have to put more knots. But if you put too much line in, the problem's going to be that you're going to be bumping into the edges of your mesh every time you push your needle through, which can deform the mesh or stretch it, causing your meshes to be uneven. And when you hang your net up, you'll be able to see the rows will simply be crooked. So you don't want to have a needle that's too big for your mesh size, and you don't want to get the right size needle and then overload it. Now we're going to talk about another type of shuttle, also a netting needle. But this one is traditionally called a netting needle. When we talk about this one, at least in my area of the country, this is always referred to as a Loomis or an H-type needle, while this is referred to as a needle or a netting needle, even though this also is properly referred to as a knitting or netting needle. If you notice, both of the ends at this end is the same on both needles. On this end it's a little bit different, and so the only real difference we're going to have is the way that we wind our line, and it also may feel different in our hand. But we'll show you how to accomplish this right now with a number 7 white bonded line. Now I've already had quite a bit of my line come off, and so we don't want that to get hung up on our spindle as we're taking it off, so we'll just take it off right from the back. Go. And the way I like to start these is by simply rolling this onto the spindle at the top of the needle. Now with a plastic needle, one of the things I really like about them is they bend very easy. If you're using a bamboo or a maple needle, you risk breaking the end off every time you do this, and in fact you can't do it that much. But with this, it's very, very easy to load up because it's made to bend. You get about to right here, you can let go of the line. That's now being held in by friction. From the very first time that I sat down with my instructor to learn this new hobby of net making, I had it in my head that if I was to ever master this skill, I would produce a video series about it. However, at the time I was not aware of any other videos out there about this subject. So, once I started to feel comfortable, I started to look around at other YouTube videos to see what was out there. Because I've got a general rule that I follow, that if somebody's got a video series about something and I can't do better, I don't make the video. It's pointless for me to try to teach you something when I can simply tell you about a video that teaches that subject that you can go watch without me getting involved. Now, there are quite a few videos out there about net making, and if you go to search, you won't find too many because in our country it is a dying art. But eventually, if you search long enough, you'll find bilingual videos about net making from other countries, which will lead you to finding videos that are in those languages. I've actually watched Russian, Spanish, and Vietnamese videos about net making, not understanding a single word that the teachers were saying, but just watching their technique. And the problem is that even though a lot of these people are very good at making nets, they're not really masters at making videos or even masters at teaching. And a big part of that is that once you make anything and you get good enough at it, you start to do it intuitively or instinctively. Like with the guy that's teaching me, I have asked him many times to make a certain knot that I can't make in slow motion, and he can't do it. He's been doing it so many times. In fact, he was telling me he learned how to tie this knot 68 years ago. So at this point in his life, he ties it instinctively, and he can't tie it any slower than what he ties it. And that's what happens when you get really good. I've only been doing this for about a year, so I have very, very clear memories of the struggle I went through at each phase of this process. So I'm still qualified as a teacher of this process. Now, another problem is that little skinny string does not lend itself well to video. I've taken videos of people that have done a very good job of making a net and put them on the largest screen I had and put them in high definition and watched them in slow motion and pausing at every move they make, and still can't figure out what they're doing because the string is just too little to see. And I even have that problem when I'm watching my teacher. So, the thing that's going to set this video series apart from every other video series that exists out there about making nets is the fact that I have figured out how to overcome this problem with a very large needle and very large line. This line here in particular is number 72. It's not really appropriate for making a cast net with a line this large, but this is a good line to have if you make cast nets because it's about the right size for running a lead line. You know, the end of this line will go through lead weight pretty easily, and since it's tarred, this is tarred line, which is what makes it black. It's actually embedded with tar instead of the standard bonding agent that we saw in our other line. That actually adds a third color, so I can make my net green and white, and I can attach my lead line with black, which I think is just, I like that kind of stuff. I like doing things that have a lot of contrast so you can see the details. And so this is how we're going to solve that problem of not being able to see what's going on while I'm knitting. And I think the first video that this would be appropriate for is this particular one where we're showing how to load the needle. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do is wrap your line around the spindle at the top of the needle, the pointy end, and pull it tight. And this is what you'll do with a smaller needle as well. And once you've done that, you just kind of hold the friction on that piece, that end piece, and pull your line down to the bottom. When you get it to the bottom, you're going to turn 1/2 turn clockwise, return back to the top. Go through the right hand side of the slot, pull it back down, go to the bottom, rotate it 1/2 turn again. it doesn't take long before you have enough line on your needle that you don't have to hold the end anymore. Now with this larger needle, you're going to notice as I'm rotating it that it's coming out very, very neat. Well, you can do that with this large line. When you're working with a very small line, like a number 3 or 4, you're not going to be able to keep it quite that orderly. And what I'm talking about is how all this line is laid next to each other. This stuff will be overlapping and sideways and crossways and diagonal, and don't worry about that. As long as you put it on tight and neat, it'll come off very neat and very easily. And that's how we wrap one of these knitting needles. Okay, right now you're looking at 3 versions of basically the same needle. The one at the bottom of your screen is made of stainless steel that's been welded, and I hope you can see the little weld right here and the one at this end. Later we'll do a video about how to make this same needle for yourself using a clothes hanger. It won't be stainless steel and it won't be welded, but it'll do the same thing that this needle will do. This one is hand carved by a man in New Orleans that does netting demonstrations making crab nets. The one on the top of your screen is basically a manufactured plastic needle that is the same size as these other 2. Now the reason I have 3 needles that are basically the same size is that I plan on doing several videos in the future about making crab nets. In fact, I just simply want to make crab nets. This size needle is a very good needle for a crab net. You're not going to be tying the same kind of knot as you would tie on a Spanish mullet net, and so you don't have to have the same kind of needle. Spanish mullet nets generally have a smaller mesh size than that this needle would be beneficial for. Crab nets, by tradition, have a much larger mesh because by law you're not allowed to keep crabs under a certain size, and it's a whole lot easier to have small crabs just fall out of your net than to have to hand pick them out of your net. If you've ever messed with crabs with your bare hands, you'll understand why. But in any case, these 3 needles are basically the same needle and are good for making large size mesh nets. Alright, I'm about to tell you about something that's not even an issue right now, but when you start knitting it is going to be an issue, and that's called memory. Memory is the quality of an object to stay in a certain position after it's been in that position for an extended period of time, and we're going to demonstrate it with this nylon, bonded nylon number 7 green on this spool here. Okay, this line has been on the spool maybe days, maybe years. But if you notice, when it comes off, it kind of stays looking like a spring, and even if you completely loosen it up and throw it back down, you're going to still see elements of that in this line. It's going to continue to try to stay in the same shape it was in when it was on this spool. When you're tying a lot of knots, say a net with 20,000 knots, and you're trying to go as fast as you possibly can so you can finish it during your lifetime, little bitty things can really throw you off. Even adding so much as 1 second to a knot can add a lot of time to the, what you're going to have to invest in building a net. Now, this is a needle that has had line on it for a long time. If you notice, I did some kind of thing with it when I got done. You don't take your line off, you just leave it there because you deal with it. But watch this, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, this property of memory exists in all things, even your body. When you try to get up out of a recliner, your body wants to stay in that recliner. But look at this. Now, it may not seem like a big deal, but when you're trying to knit with this, if you notice, when I'm moving the needle, it's moving the line that's associated with that needle in kind of unnatural way. If you're messing with hemp or sisal or jute, some kind of a natural fiber like cotton especially, it doesn't have so much memory. But with a bonded synthetic line or a tarred synthetic line, those bonding agents are like a plastic, and they're going to make that stay there. So there's a few things you want to try to avoid. Is one, if your needle is loaded, don't set it on the dash of your car and park in the sun. Although that may benefit you if you are knitting in your car in the sun with the windows rolled up, because a hotter line is not going to stay as stiff as this. But if you're not planning on using your string for a long time, don't load your needles up. Just leave them. They do a lot better on the spool than they will on your needle. And also just try to avoid any kind of, if you run into a material that has a really significant problem with this, just avoid that material. But you know, even this line here is one of the worst I work with. It's not as bad as say, you know, a monofilament line like you would have on a fish line on your fishing pole, rod and reel, but it's still pretty bad. But you know what, that's $12 worth of line. I'm not going to throw it away because of this problem, because there's really nothing to guarantee that the next line I get won't have the same problem. I always end up having needles laying around with line on them. There's no getting around it. The reasons for keeping line on a needle are many. One could be that you finish knitting a net and there's still line on your needle, so you're not going to take that off. But another could be you're preparing to knit a net, especially if you're like me, you might be knitting a net in front of a crowd. You don't want to be loading a needle in front of a crowd. That's not what people show up to see. Another thing is repair needles. You always want to have line on your repair needles, but those needles are relatively short. This is a knitting needle, which is a very long one. I like to use as long of a needle as possible when knitting so that I can put as much line on my needle at once as possible. But this is what happened. Everything on top of this needle is line. It just simply is too tight. You would never load a needle like that. I know I didn't load this needle like this. I suspect that changes in the atmosphere are causing this, or maybe just age. You know, as plastics age, they tend to shrink. Humidity can make things swell up. Temperature can make things contract or expand. And if you've got two different materials, like this needle is one material and the line is a different material, they're going to have different rates of expansion and contraction. So I suspect that the reason this needle is like this is because it was loaded during the time of the year when it was a different temperature than it is now. Just a theory, but it's based on solid scientific principles. Just know that you really don't want to keep a whole bunch of really long needles loaded up. Now that you understand the basic concept of how a needle works and you know how to load line on your needle, all you really need to learn is how to use those loaded needles to start making knots. I'm ready to start and have two different colors of line loaded up on two needles in order to make my next cast net. And I'm going to videotape myself making that cast net as part of this video series. You'll also see me working occasionally with repair needles. These are smaller needles that you keep set aside with line on them so that if you do make a mistake while you're knitting, you don't have to cut your line, make your repair, and then go back and reattach your line. It's just for a convenience, and you do not need this many needles to make a net. You really only need one. But when you order a needle, which you'll probably have to order it online, you're probably not going to have somebody in your neighborhood selling these things. Most of the expense is in the shipping, so you will pay very little extra to get a complete set of needles than what you would pay just to purchase one needle. If you continue to follow along with this series, you'll eventually figure out how to make nearly any kind of net you want to make. But the first net that we're going to be making is going to be a cast net. That being said, you need to know there are two distinctly different kinds of cast nets, each with its own advantages and disadvantages, each more or less suitable depending on what kind of situation you're going to be using it in. I can't make the decision for you about what kind of net to make, so what I'm going to do is make a video about the two different kinds of cast nets so that you can learn what the differences are and make that decision for yourself. Now, this series is teaching what's called the dyeing art, and a lot of people want to learn how to make a net because they think it's wrong for a culture to simply go away. I personally feel like if a culture doesn't work, it needs to go away. But there isn't anything to guarantee that as our culture progresses, it will continue to grow technically to the point where things from the past are no longer important. It is altogether possible that this society we live in will follow the same path as every society that came before it, advancing technically over hundreds of years until they reach the point where they collapse, and all that's left is people who do not know how to take care of themselves. Knowing how to make a cast net or any kind of net puts you head and shoulders above most of the people that live in our society. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.